Welcome to BookRising, a podcast by the Radical Books Collective.
Thank you, everyone, for tuning in again to the Radical Publishing Future series of our BookRising podcast here at Radical Books Collective. I am delighted today to introduce Firoze Manji, founder of Daraja Press, and also adjunct professor at the Institute of African Studies at Carleton University, and who has a long career in international development, health, and human rights, in addition to his work as a publisher. Among his previous roles, he has worked as Africa Program Director for Amnesty International, Chief Executive of the Aga Khan Foundation in the UK, and Regional Representative for Health Sciences in Eastern and Southern Africa for the Canadian International Development Research Centre. He has published widely on health, human rights, development, and politics. Daraja Press is a not-for-profit independent press that publishes fiction and nonfiction primarily from the Global South, which aims, in their words, quote, to reclaim the past, contest the present, and invent the future. Recent titles of note include Decolonization and Afrofeminism by the towering Ugandan feminist Sylvia Tamale, and an edited collection, Fanon Today, edited by British scholar Nigel Gibson, marking the 60th anniversary of the publication of The Wretched of the Earth. A warm welcome to you, Firoze.
Many thanks for having me on your show.
So happy to have you here. So Daraja Press comes from the Swahili word Daraja, meaning bridge, and I wondered if there's a story behind that name, and maybe your own transition into publishing. Could you tell us a little bit about how you ended up founding Daraja Press?
Sure. It's a long story, but I was responsible for establishing. I founded an online magazine called Pambazuka News, which is a radical voice of and for and by Africans for social justice, and it was a Pan-African network. Which eventually we had by the time I left, about 3,500 authors who wrote for it. Over the 12 years that I worked there. And we reached an annual, the last year we'd reached about 1 million annual readers, unique readers in 1 year.
Wow.
It was quite extraordinary. It just had a life of its own. It was clearly a space where so little was being acknowledged, or even we didn't even know about each other and the thinking that was going on. And so that platform opened it up in a really great way. And then we started publishing books because there were some collections of essays in which we published, we thought would be useful to put into book form. And then that just led to people submitting manuscripts and so on. And that went on until 2012 when I left. And they stopped publishing Pambazuka Press. They stopped publishing books, and Pambazuka News eventually stopped being published. So Pambazuka meant the new dawn, but I couldn't use that term again. So I looked for something that it gave expression to the task of building bridges of solidarity between movements, between the exploited of the world, to help the sort of interconnections between emancipatory struggles of the oppressed around the world. And in a phrase, our aim is to nurture reflection, to shelter hope, and inspire audacity. Because I think if we can make all three happen, then we are beginning to open a space where those who've been denied their humanity can invent what it means to be human. That's really been the heart of it. And it started, just as a sort of casual idea. Well, if Pharmaceutical Press has stopped, then we can let's 1 or 2 books a year, 3 or 4 books a year, maybe. And we started with an anthology of Amilcar Cabral's writings and reflections on his contribution to the struggle for humanization. And that was done with Codestria, the Council for Development Social Research in Africa. And then we were approached by Maynooth University to collaborate on the publication of the last writings of Ken Saro-Wiwa. And that then put us in a really good position, that we were in one go. Suddenly we were publishing things which I thought were really important. But that was all done sort of while I was doing other work. And so it was a pro bono activity, but then in 2018 I moved to Canada, so I was retired. I didn't need to earn money through doing that. So my work has been pro bono since then, and it's just grown, and it's grown faster than I'd ever anticipated, or sometimes I wonder more than I wished. I mean, we've got 64 titles published, and 22 of them were published last year, and probably the same number or more this year. That's very exciting. I mean, we've touched a nerve of some kind, so yeah, no, it's really interesting.
And this was, remind me, this was 2015 when it started?
Yes, sort of around then. Yeah, but 2013 or 24. Yeah, 2013 was when the Saro-Wiwa book and the Amilcar Cabral book were published. Okay. But we've also sought to provide a platform in terms of audiobook, podcasts. So we've published about 120 podcasts, some related to our publications, but mostly on critical issues that are arising. And we did a whole series on organizing in the time of COVID, which opened up some really interesting dimensions. And we, I think, were the first to really give some people an idea of how, from the perspective of organizers on the ground across the world, whether it was from China or Thailand or from Latin America or elsewhere, the commonalities of what was happening, and it can be summed up basically. I mean, it was, and I think it's still the case. It's summed up by, if you belong to the sacred space, you're in the middle classes, etc., you're pierced with a needle. If you belong to the sacrifice zones, you're pierced with a bullet. And that was really the message that came across. So yeah, that's how we got going, and that's where we are at the moment.
Amazing. And how do you go about deciding what to publish? I mean, it sounds like your list has grown even faster than you anticipated. So, and you've also mentioned several collaborations with other organizations and publishing entities. So talk a little bit about what that process is like, your selection criteria, or how you go about choosing.
Yeah. That's a very good question. I mean, I think the most fundamental question that we pose when we look at proposals is to ask, in what way will this contribute to the struggle for human emancipation? Africans in particular have experienced, 500 years of being considered, first of all, non-human, and therefore to be able to be enslaved, and then less than human, and then eventually uncivilized. And today, they're considered underdeveloped, okay, lacking all those qualities that the West believes describes what they themselves see as the epitome of being human. And so and that's the same situation. I mean, patriarchy and racism have been a sort of common thread throughout our history. And so the question is, what can we do to try to give space to reflections on that? And it doesn't have to be, as it were, from an ideological, it can be a broad church, as it were, of perspectives, but giving people an opportunity to think deeply and to write and to stimulate ideas on that basis. And we've tried with some poetry, we've tried with some novels. And our difficulty is that, I think poetry and particularly poetry, I think it's a very particular niche, and to get yourself known in that field is much more difficult than with nonfiction, and novels also. And I wish we knew how to get. I mean, part of the problem we have is that we're caught in this catch-22 here. You can't get funding here because you have to be promoting Canadian authors. Well, we're an international organization. We're not interested just in Canadianism, and then distributors won't take you because you don't publish enough. But you don't sell enough books in Canada. But we don't sell enough books in Canada because we don't have a distributor. So you're caught in that dilemma. But the other thing is, I think is we try to negotiate with all our authors and editors that the PDFs of our books should be available for free from our website. I think it's really important because in most parts of the world, either you don't have the currency, you just don't have the money to do that. And that's true in Canada and the USA and so on. And so the question is, how do we do that? We encourage people we focus on the use value rather than on just the exchange value. And I think that's the other criteria we then use to decide whether to take something on. And that's answering the question, to what extent can this be used in organizing? How will it contribute to organizing? How will it because I think that the life of a book begins at the point of publication, whereas publishers often see the end of the process being the book being published. And the question is, how to get around that. I don't think we have any definitive answer to that. But finding ways to make what is written, what is produced, alive and meaningful for people. And of course it'll vary. There'll be different people. Some different things will mean more for one group of people than the others. But I think that's really how we try to operate.
And it seems to me that you've mentioned novels and poetry, but you're primarily publishing nonfiction, some of which is written by academics with a pretty academic approach. And I'm wondering also about how you've talked about wanting the work to be alive, to be discussed, to be available to audiences that might not otherwise have access. And so how does the voice, the academic voice fit into that desire for your publication?
Well, there's this lovely line in Chimamanda Adichie's book on Americana, when she has a character say that the difference between an academic and an intellectual is that an academic builds walls and an intellectual breaks them. And so we're publishing intellectuals, particularly those who are engaged in struggles for of different kinds, but who are engaged. So actually, we try to avoid academics. We do get a lot of submissions from academics, and that takes a lot of time because, again, we have to find a nice way of saying no. But it is a really important distinction to make, and that I have a sort of titular position as an adjunct professor. Doesn't make me an academic, but it is a question of therefore then not being dismissive of intellectual work, but also try to do what we try to do in Pambazuka as well, and I think quite successfully, is to enable this conversation to take place between the organic intellectuals on the ground who come up through the struggles and the intellectual, engaged intellectuals who have something to contribute, but who also have ears to listen. And I think that's also important. Yeah. And so, recently we published a thing called Life Histories from the Revolution, 3 militants from the Kenya Land and Freedom Army. I mean, these were people, they're not academics. They were, who were engaged in a real life struggle against the British Empire. And we've published reflections from Kenyan activists about people like Pio Gama Pinto, who was one of the first people assassinated by the Kenyatta regime in Kenya after independence. And so, we legitimize their voice amongst the voices of what you might see as academics, but not these, a division of labor, people who are, who think, and write, but who are engaged in struggles, not merely for career promotion of their building of walls.
Yeah, that's helpful. You've mentioned podcasts, and I know that Daraja also has other sort of non-book, not material and content outside of traditional book formats. And I was just going to ask you about this, the last couple of decades turn toward the digital and how that has changed your approach at all, or the relationship between traditional print publishing and these other kinds of content making.
No, I think there's been an enormous change. Having spent 20 years in publishing and having to deal with it in a very different way to what we're doing now. I mean, the entire production. I mean, I do all the typesetting online. The production is online. The distribution is online. It's transformed publishing, and it means that the unit cost of publishing has dropped quite dramatically. The problem is when you put it into print, it's still expensive, which is why we have this policy. Okay, well, the work has been done. Once you produce a PDF, the work has been done. Why are you charging people for it? It's already, the labor has been incorporated there, and it shouldn't be a basis for turning into a commodity. It should be there to stimulate that discussion, to stimulate people to use it and to reflect on it. And I think that's really important. I mean, but how do you distribute these things? And one of the questions that you pose you about the behemoth of Amazon, well, what can you do? They dominate the market and pay you pin money for after they've taken their bite of the cherry. And so the question is, what can be done? I mean, what's the possibilities for the emergence of cooperatives for online distributions? What are the possibilities? I mean, I don't know. I mean, surely there must be discussions among some activists who work at Amazon about what the potentials might be. That one day maybe of challenging the behemoth from within. I think we just have to keep an eye out on what the possibilities are. But I think our dilemma is one which other radical publishers, small independent publishers, also face. And I think what you are all doing at the Radical Books Collective is really very, very important. But it's also, we need to take it to steps saying, well, what can we do to make it possible for all of us to get our books available? Because it's not going to, we can't always depend on the behemoths. So that really is, I think that's a real challenge. And I don't have easy answers for that. But I think the first step is to problematize before we come up with a solution.
Yeah. And are there other avenues through which you are reaching readers? Is it the same million subscribers to Pambazuka who are readers?
Oh, I wish. Yeah. No, I don't know. I mean, we have to build that up from the ground. I mean, I think the pandemic has created a real problem because conversations. Okay, we have some good conversations with Radical Book Collective and so, but imagine those face to face. Imagine the drink afterwards, sitting in a cafe somewhere and talking more casually. I miss that. But then that's why I do some teaching, and because then I'm in contact with young people. Okay, and it's a learning process as well, because they see the world in different ways that I do. And that's what inspired us to produce pamphlets, short books, because there is a reluctance to read, and which is such a shame. But so we experiment with producing pamphlets as a way of saying, okay, this will give you an introduction. Maybe it'll stimulate you to go to the library. There's some other much deeper reflections that worth looking at. So the task is, how do you stimulate that? And we're playing around with the idea of maybe producing audio books as well. But I'm not sure. I just wonder whether the podcasting we've done has been really interesting, because there have been conversations. They're not most of them are not talking heads, but rather conversations between people. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a really, really important way. And so whether that translate into an audible book kind of format, I don't know. But worth experimenting with. I don't know what you think.
Are those conversations primarily with authors that you're also publishing, or are these other thinkers that aren't also in your?
No, with many others who who are engaged on the ground, or engaged in organizing on the ground, their perspectives, conversations with them, and then of course with books as well. But also we try to try and get that conversation going with contributors, with authors and editors. Otherwise, I don't know how you feel, but listen to talking heads after a while, my attention just drifts, and it's a shame, but that's what this medium has resulted in, and there's so little laughter. I mean, well, it's such a human thing, and if we cannot laugh, we cannot cry. I mean, it's it's very formalized in its way of interacting.
Yeah, I mean, you and I were joking earlier about webinars, but also something that Bhakti and I talk about a lot about this sort of period of the pandemic is the expectation for kind of passive content. So that element of discussion, that conversation that you're talking about, sort of falling out of it. And one of our ideas at Radical Books Collective is that, we invest a little more. We all make a kind of pact together. We're gonna engage the text fully, and we're gonna talk it out. Even sort of without the formal pressures of a classroom environment, and no expectations necessarily of where people are coming from or their previous reading experiences, but just an attempt to make that kind of a space for. I mean, I've only attended a couple of your book groups, but I just found it so stimulating, so interesting to listen to different perspectives, and also to hear from the authors themselves. I think you've created something really important here, and I think it works well on this medium. It would be nice if we were all together, but because it's a conversation and not just talking heads, then there is something. There is a certain intimacy that emerges from that. There's a compassion that's shown, which in talking heads it's absent. The emotions are absent. The laughter, the vulnerability, those are absent. And that's also a problem with books. And the question is, so I'm really impressed with what you're doing, because I think that is important. You're making books come alive. That they are the publication is only the start of a process, and you can see that in the conversations that have been there. So I've really just benefited. I think it's just terrific what you're doing. I'm so glad to hear that. Well, what for you? I mean, you've answered this a little bit, but do you think would really have to change for these kinds of spaces that we've been talking about, and also just for independent book publishing, non-corporate book publishing to thrive?
I think what the Radical Books Collective is doing is helping to nurture these. The Radical Books Alliance as well. That's also, and I think we need to just nurture that. I mean, there is a tendency in the publishing field to see other publishers as competitors, whereas actually it's like a choir. an orchestra. I mean, the sound of a violin and the sound of a piano are quite different, but they can be singing the same tune and bringing their own particular harmonies to bear. And I think that's what we need to nurture. That an orchestra of publishers, as it were, and that gives virtue to every instrument. Without it being seen, it's my space and it's your space. And so that's why we actively sought to build co-publishing arrangements with a number of other publishers, just because I think that's how we try to do that, so that we enhance each other rather than simply saying we're the best in the game, Which I don't need to say, because of course I am.
What's that saying? Well, it's interesting. I mean, I wonder from that perspective whether you see places in the Canadian context, in the US context, where there are really missing sections of that orchestra. What's missing that's still needed in your music making, as it were, to go with that metaphor?
Well, I think I mean, being new in this continent, we've not really yet found a way to connect. But I think there's that whole indigenous experiences and the stories and the histories and what I would like to see is, because one of the things I found really striking, the same bastards who are destroying the environment in Africa, the Canadian mining companies who are destroying the environment, who are polluting the waters, who are exploiting people, it's the same bastards who are doing the same thing right here, okay, amongst the same communities, and the issues are just so much the same, and I think one of the things is to find ways in which that conversation between people in different parts of the world who are facing exactly the same issue, that's something that needs to be nurtured. And we've tried to do this not terribly successfully with conversations between shack dwellers in Nairobi and in South Africa and in other places. So because it's building on commonalities, even though there are different histories and different experiences. And I'd love to find ways to make that happen. And because there are stories, in different communities, and too much of publishing, I think, is about preaching rather than listening and giving voice to, giving space for. And it's not an easy medium to do that in. That's the reality. But I think just we shelter hope, and we can continue to do that.
Yeah. Well, tell us what's forthcoming at Daraja. What's in the immediate future, and what should we have our eyes out for?
Oh gosh, well, this is another co-publishing deal that we've just arranged with Jacana Press in South Africa, and they published the International Brigade Against Apartheid. Secrets of the People's War that liberated South Africa, and we are publishing, I hope next week or so, a North American edition of that, because there was quite a substantial movement in North America and in Canada in particular around the anti-apartheid movement,
Fantastic.
So that's one. Another one coming out very shortly is an area which touches on some of your questions, and that's the whole issue of social media and capitalism, how they operate, and then how capitalism has adapted and is voraciously sucking out and setting the terms of discussions around the role of social media. So that's something that we've got coming out. Another is this is a lovely. It's called A Mutiny of Mourning, and it's appropriation of Conrad's Heart of Darkness, and what this woman has done. She's done some beautiful illustrations, but what she's done, she's taken pages from Heart of Darkness and blacked out and left only a few words, which reinterpret and shows how there's been a black appropriation of that book, and I think that's a really exciting project that's coming up. And we've got a book coming out on Palestine and human rights and health, mental health, celebrating the life of Ayad Sarraj, who founded the Gaza Community Mental Health Care Program. And we're republishing a novel which was published back in 1983 by Penguin, but which has gone out of print, Hand on the Sun, the struggle of, which is based on a really interesting situation of young Asians organizing in the north of England, in Bradford, who were then charged with terrorism offenses and locked up, and but were eventually were cleared of that. And this novel arose out of that situation. Hand on the Sun, I think it's going to be a very interesting one to work with. And then finally, there's some. Sorry?
Who's the author of Hand on the Sun?
That's Tariq Mahmood.
Okay.
And then there is white saviorism in international development, which I think is going to be a lot of fun. It's something that I've written a lot about, and so to have a book by others on this, I think is going to be great. Yeah.
Wonderful. Critical conversations. Thank you so much, Firoze, for your time. This has been lovely to hear from you.
Well, thanks so much. I'm really honored to be interviewed by you guys. And you're doing really, really interesting work, and I hope you'll continue doing that.